Well, we managed to get through a few weeks without a massive ethics scandal surrounding the Supreme Court. I guess good for us. But that streak ended today. Because today we learned that Justice Clarence Thomas failed to disclose even more private flights provided by conservative billionaire Harlan Crow. Senator Ron Wyden detailed in a letter today how the Senate Judiciary Committee obtained international flight records showing that back in November 2010, Justice Thomas and his wife flew from Hawaii to New Zealand on Mr. Crow's private jet before flying back from New Zealand to Hawaii on the jet a week later. The letter goes on, Mr. Crow was also a passenger on these flights. To date, Justice Thomas has never disclosed this private jet travel on any financial disclosure forms, even though Justice Thomas has amended disclosures to reflect other international travel on Mr. Crow's private jet. If you'll recall, ProPublica had exposed a 2019 trip Thomas took to Indonesia and several others provided by Harlan Crow. And the outcry resulting from that story prompted Thomas to formally disclose those trips in financial filings submitted this year. So that begs the question, why did he fail to disclose the Hawaii-New Zealand trips over a decade ago? Maybe because he thought he could simply get away with it? Of course, what might be helpful here is a code of ethics with some teeth, like the one President Biden proposed last week. And on that point, here's what Justice Neil Gorsuch told Fox News in an interview that aired just yesterday.
When the spotlight's on you, when the government's coming after you, and don't you want a ferociously independent judge and a jury of your peers to make those decisions? Isn't that your right as an American? And so I just say, be careful.
Now, I don't want to over-dramatize, but I mean, be careful sounds a little like a thinly veiled threat from a Supreme Court justice to the President of the United States. Sherilyn Ifill, who will have thoughts on this, I am sure, and I can't wait to hear them, joins me now. She's the former president of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. She's now the Vernon Jordan Endowed Chair in Civil Rights at Howard University. So I want to ask you about Gorsuch's comments, but I want to start with Thomas. I mean, he didn't disclose those flights from 14 years ago. He only disclosed the Indonesia trip. I'm not saying we should be surprised here necessarily, and I'm not going to ask you to get into his head on how to explain his thinking, but it just feels like there's this pattern of the belief that there's no consequences. And I just wonder, and we've talked about this before, what can happen to change this behavior?
Well, at this point, they're not wrong. There are no consequences. And what we're seeing, I think, in the steady drip, is the way in which the court really doesn't think that they are obligated to share all of this information as fully as possible. We should never have had to request this information that was initially not disclosed. But then to drip out some of the information, but not all of the information, and to have these continual reports telling us about more trips, all quite lavish trips with the same individual, is deeply concerning. This is an actual kind of scandal, or at least would be if we were in normal times. And we're not in normal times, right? When Abe Fortas had to step down from the Supreme Court, it was Democrats who leaned on him. He was Lyndon Johnson's close friend. And Johnson had to call him up and say, listen, you got to step down for something that pales in comparison to the revelations that we've had about some of these financial dealings. And so we're not in normal times. We have a dysfunctional Congress. We have a Republican Party that will not engage on this issue of ethics. And so essentially there are no consequences. That doesn't mean that this is not deeply troubling and really quite concerning in terms of the court's independence, which ironically Justice Gorsuch was just talking about.
So let me ask, because it's a perfect segue, because, I don't want to over dramatize what he said there, where he said, be careful. But it does sound a bit, he was asked about Joe Biden, the President Biden's Supreme Court reform proposals. That's what he said in response. What did you make of that?
Jen, I didn't take it as a threat. I took it as condescension, to be honest. No one is cavalierly approaching the idea of Supreme Court reform. I think I've shared with you, I've had my own very slow evolution on this issue. But I always felt that there would have to be a responsible process. One of the reasons that I joined President Biden's Supreme Court Commission when I was asked to join in 2022, I guess at this point, is because I believed that should reform happen at some point in the future, there needs to be a process, a careful process. And so I'm not sure how it would seem cavalier for the president to have several years ago assembled a group of very prominent lawyers and legal minds and scholars, a bipartisan group, and created a commission, not ask for recommendations, but just ask for study of the issues. Wait another 2 years amid conversation among people who are asking for significantly more drastic change than the president has proposed, and in the midst of revelations that have come as a result of the press from ProPublica about these violations that several of the justices have engaged in. And we've had also the upside down flag at Justice Alito's home. We've had Ginny Thomas at the Stop the Steal rally. We've had all of this stuff happening. We've had, one of the Republican religious individuals who was trying to lobby the court kind of confess that he'd been lobbying the court and had purchased a building across the street from the court to have better access. So much has happened in the 2 years since the commission that certainly has moved me, but I think has moved the president as well. And so for Justice Gorsuch to say, be careful, with a kind of tone of condescension as though something reckless or cavalier is being considered here, that's how I took that remark. And I actually think that the president showed tremendous care.
Yeah, that's such an important point. And as you just noted, I mean, he had a long journey on this. He had been former chairman of the Judiciary Committee. He's been very thoughtful on this issue, as you have been. Took him a long time to get to this point, and a lot of their actions prompted it. Let me ask you, I mean, Vice President Harris, she endorsed the reform proposal by President Biden. She's spoken, prior to him speaking about it, about court expansion, things like that, on the campaign trail. What do you want to hear from her about the court as this campaign unfolds?
Well, what I want to hear from the candidate and from the party, from the Democratic Party, is an explanation to the voters of how Supreme Court reform would happen. Because what I don't want is to get on the other side of this election, and even if the vice president is elected president, to then have people say, well, change the Supreme Court. This is not something that can happen by presidential fiat. We would need to have both houses of Congress prepared to pass legislation to make any of these reform proposals really happen and have some teeth to them. And so I think it's incumbent on the Democrats and the candidate to begin talking about the need for the Democrats to win the House and the Senate if what people want is to have some kind of Supreme Court reform. That's really not on the president. Congress holds the power over the Supreme Court to decide their salaries, to decide how many justices are on the court. And Congress has used that power in the past. When Andrew Johnson nominated his attorney general, Andrew Johnson, maybe the second worst president in the history of our country, nominated his attorney general to fill an open seat on the court, Congress was so annoyed that they eliminated the seat. I mean, Congress has the power. We started out with 6. In 1789, 6 justices. So we had as many justices as there were federal circuits. We've gone up to 8. At one point, we had 10. We're back to 9. And we've got 13 federal circuits. It would be perfectly logical to have 13 justices on the Supreme Court. But all of that power, including the jurisdiction of the court, sits with Congress. The president can sign a bill, but the president cannot make the bill happen. So I think it needs to be explained to voters so that they understand that when they get in that booth, if Supreme Court reform is what they want, it's not enough to just vote for the president. You have to also understand the importance of having the House and the Senate.
Such an important reminder. I feel like you need to do a TED Talk on this for people, Sherilyn, so that they understand the branches of government and everybody's responsibility.
2020, just as officials in Wayne County, Michigan, were about to certify the vote in that year's presidential election, 2 of that county's election officials, both of them Republicans, got a surprise call from the President of the United States, Donald Trump himself, and the then chair of the Republican Party, Ronna McDaniel, called them personally. According to the Detroit News, Trump and Ms. McDaniel then told those 2 county election officials they needed essentially to take back their vote to certify the election results. And those 2 county officials did actually try to take back their vote to certify. Then when it was time to certify the elections at the state level, Republicans in Michigan again tried to block the vote total from being certified. It was only after one very brave Republican election official broke with his fellow Republicans that Michigan's state results were finally able to be made official. Republicans pioneered this in Michigan in 2020. Now Republicans have kept trying this kind of thing in every election since, including in congressional elections. In the primaries in the 2022 midterms, Republicans in at least 10 counties refused to certify the vote. In the general election in the midterms that year, county level Republicans in Pennsylvania and in Arizona tried to block the certification of the results. This year, Republican elections officials in multiple jurisdictions have refused to certify lawful elections repeatedly. And now they're laying the foundation to do it again for the next national election. Over the weekend, Donald Trump held a rally in Atlanta where he randomly shouted out by name 3 members of the Georgia State Board of Elections. Those 3 officials have all refused to acknowledge that Joe Biden won the 2020 presidential election. They are now trying to push through new rules that would make it easier for county-level officials to refuse to certify election results. This seems to be part of a unified strategy. Encourage Republican elections officials at every level to refuse to certify the elections, no matter what the results are. It doesn't matter where. It doesn't matter if it's a county that Democrats won or a county that Republicans won. Refusing to certify the election at the local level just sticks a wrench in the works, right? It makes it impossible to certify. If you make it impossible to certify a county, then you make it effectively impossible to certify a state. And then ultimately, that puts the whole tallying of the presidential election result into question. Veteran Democratic elections lawyer Mark Elias writes, quote, "It is worse this election than previous ones because this year the GOP is far more organized. They might have tried to subvert the results in a handful of places in 2020 and 2022, but this year they will try to subvert them all." Setting the stage now for what is to come in November. Joining us now is Mark Elias, who specializes in election litigation, and he's the founder of Democracy Docket. Mr. Elias, thank you very much for joining us tonight. I appreciate you being here.
Thank you for having me.
So we've been talking about this on and off for months. We've been talking about it pretty intensively for the last few weeks. Let me just ask you as an expert, if not the expert in this field, am I getting any of this wrong or seeing any of this the wrong way around, or am I presenting this in a way that you think basically captures the facts?
I think you captured it entirely correctly. I mean, the fact is that when we talk about who won an election, we're really talking about 2 things. We're talking about the unofficial results that people get on election night, which is what AP reports, what NBC and MSNBC use to call elections on election night. But then we are really talking about the certified results. And these are the results that are first approved at the polling place and then at the county, and as you point out, then at the state, and then ultimately in presidential elections that choose the electors, and then those certificates from the governor go to the Congress. And Rachel, if you think of it this way, January 6th was the culmination of a certification dispute, which, as you point out, began, among other places, in Michigan at the county level. And when Republicans couldn't achieve what they wanted to at the county level, they went to the state level. When they couldn't achieve that, they launched a fake elector scheme, which was just another way of undermining accurate certification of elections. When they couldn't do that, they launched a series of frivolous lawsuits. And finally, they attempted to block what on January 6th? The certification of the election. So this has been on their radar screen for some time, and it would be on their radar screen for sure in 2024.
We have seen them not just planning to do this for the 2024 election, but trying it out in multiple jurisdictions. You, among others, have pointed out that this is a tactic at the county elections board level that was essentially unheard of before 2020. But now it has happened literally dozens of times, sometimes in very off the radar, like municipal elections, sometimes in primaries, sometimes in general elections. There hasn't yet been another presidential election during which they've tried it. But what have you learned about how this process works, how these essentially concocted controversies can be resolved when they do this stuff at the county level?
Yeah, I mean, look, I have done more recounts and post-election litigation than any other person ever, and I had never seen it before 2020. In 2020, I represented President Biden in the DNC in 60-plus cases. We saw it in Michigan, but before that, I had done recounts for Al Franken in Minnesota for various Senate campaigns, statewide campaigns, and the idea of tinkering with the certification at the local level was just out of bounds. I mean, that is part of the pageantry of democracy. It is what makes us great as a country, that after a hard-fought election, the election officials celebrate the results by certifying these election results, and whatever takes place in court after that takes place after that in court. But Rachel, we saw in 2022 that they refused to certify the elections in Cochise County, Arizona, and in several places in Pennsylvania. I sued them. We won. The folks in Cochise County subsequently got indicted for it. And you might think that would serve as a deterrent for 2024. But, as Donald Trump proved, the loyalty to his crimes and misdeeds is stronger than people's instinct for self-preservation.
Briefly, Mark, what can people who are concerned about this do to try to make sure it doesn't happen?
Yeah, so we all play a role. So first of all, thank you for calling this out. Lawyers, we go to court, but, making this public is the big part of the battle. And I'd ask every person listening to this to speak out on this. Don't stay silent. You all have a town square. You don't all have millions of viewers like Rachel Maddow, but each and every one of you can post on social media. You can attend these canvass board meetings. You can file comments in Georgia before the state election board. In your own counties, you can know who is on these boards, and you can attend their meetings. Every citizen has a role to play here. And if we all do that, I am confident that we will defeat these efforts and Kamala Harris will be sworn in as the next president of the United States.
Mark Elias, lawyer specializing in election litigation, the founder of Democracy Docket. Mark, I have a feeling this is the start of several conversations we're going to have on this. Thank you so much for your time tonight. Keep us surprised, okay?
Well, Kamala Harris was in the Situation Room today with President Biden while the laziest presidential campaigner in history was, as usual, doing nothing. Donald Trump, now the oldest presidential nominee in history, is running scared and lazy, showing no idea how to campaign against Vice President Kamala Harris. Trump's only attempt so far to campaign against Vice President Harris was to question her racial identity, something even Lindsey Graham publicly advised him to stop doing. Donald Trump's most enduring and reliable quality is his stupidity, so it is possible that Donald Trump alone in America does not understand that black fathers produce black babies. But Donald Trump's racist idiocy helped Donald Trump in one way last week. It helped reduce attention to more important stories, like the one we were just talking about, the possible $10 million bribe that Egypt may have paid Donald Trump when he won the presidency in 2016. We'll be covering that important story later in this hour, just as Rachel did in the previous hour, because that is a much more important story than anything Donald Trump has said and should not be overshadowed by Trump idiocy. 49% of American voters now correctly believe that Donald Trump does not have the mental capacity to serve as president of the United States. In a CBS poll released yesterday, 49% say that Donald Trump does not have the mental and cognitive health to serve as president. Even Donald Trump knows he does not have the mental and cognitive health to debate Kamala Harris, which is why, in a move that for him was both wise and cowardly, he backed out of his promise to participate in a presidential debate scheduled by ABC for September 10th. Vice President Harris responded saying, "I'll be there on September 10th, like he agreed to. I hope to see him there." Donald Trump obviously fears debating Kamala Harris more than any candidate has ever feared debating. And so we might never see them debate. I'll keep a chair open here any night for Vice President Harris to come by and debate tape of Donald Trump explaining his position on tariffs and taxes and repealing Obamacare and cutting Social Security and Medicare and cutting taxes for billionaires. I would be happy to show the vice president tape of Donald Trump clarifying his policy on Israel and Gaza, but he has not said a word about it. Kamala Harris has strengthened her campaign staff with some hugely important new hires. David Plouffe, who was President Obama's winning campaign manager, is joining the Harris campaign staff. Nothing like having another winning presidential campaign manager on the team, along with Jen O'Malley Dillon, who already has won a presidential campaign. Stephanie Cutter, another winner from the Obama campaign, is joining the Harris campaign staff, as is economic policy advisor Gene Sperling, who has been on the staff of every winning Democratic presidential campaign since Bill Clinton. And Jennifer Palmieri, who served in the Obama-Harris White House as the communications director, has also joined the Harris campaign, making the Harris campaign staff the single strongest group of campaign winners that we have ever seen on any presidential campaign staff. Kamala Harris was in the Situation Room with President Biden today after Hezbollah fired rockets at Israel yesterday. The president described today's meeting in the Situation Room this way. Earlier, Vice President and I were briefed in the Situation Room on developments in the Middle East. We received updates on threats posed by Iran and its proxies, diplomatic efforts to de-escalate regional tensions, and preparations to support Israel should it be attacked again. We also discussed the steps we are taking to defend our forces and respond to any attack against our personnel in a manner and place of our choosing. Donald Trump will never be in that Situation Room again. Donald Trump knows that his future next year is in courtrooms as defendant Trump, unless he can find some way to take the Electoral College away from Kamala Harris. And he knows he cannot do that by debating her. So Donald Trump will stick to the laziest presidential campaign schedule since the invention of jet travel by doing his one rally a week campaign. This week, it will be in the electorally unimportant state of Montana, which Donald Trump won last time by 16 points and will win again this year. And every time Donald Trump speaks publicly, he will slur some of his words, as he always does. He will mispronounce words. He will get names wrong. He will get names of countries wrong. He will speak words that never come close to forming sentences. And he will continue to prove to more voters that he does not have the mental and cognitive health to serve as president. Meanwhile, Kamala Harris's campaign for president is off to what has been universally declared to be a great start, thanks, at the beginning, to the flawlessly smooth way President Biden handed off the control of their campaign to Vice President Harris on the afternoon of Sunday, July 21st. President Biden's endorsement of Vice President Harris that day began a surge of enthusiasm for Kamala Harris, including campaign contributions, thousands of new campaign volunteers, and a steady stream of important Democratic Party endorsements, and the refusal of any other Democratic candidate to even consider challenging Kamala Harris for the presidential nomination. According to a headline in the New York Times today, some people at the Times think, quote, Kamala Harris surprises everyone. Not everyone. Many of us have seen for a long time what people are seeing in Kamala Harris now. 15 years ago in Los Angeles, I was brought to an event where I was told I would see the female Obama. That's what black people in the know in California politics called Kamala Harris then, when she was the San Francisco district attorney. They believed, and I believed when I listened to her that day, that Kamala Harris, like Barack Obama, could go all the way to the White House. I, for one, have seen nothing new about Kamala Harris in her so far brilliant presidential campaign. She is not surprising everyone. And she is not surprising our first guest tonight, who knew Kamala Harris in California back in the days when only Californians knew that Kamala Harris could go all the way. United States senators do not get security details. They don't get Secret Service or anything like that. I've never heard of a United States senator being harassed in a public place like an airport when I was working in the Senate, but the Trump era is different. In the third year of the Trump presidency, Senator Kamala Harris was harassed in an airport by a Trump fanatic who is now a member of Congress from Florida, Republican Anna Paulina Luna, whose first claim to public attention was as a swimsuit model. The woman you will see protecting Senator Harris in the video you're about to see is our first guest tonight. She was then a campaign staffer for Senator Harris and is now the junior United States Senator from California, LaFonza Butler.
Hi, man. How are you doing today? Hi, how are you? Hi, I'm the director of Hispanic Engagement with Turning Point USA. I want to know about the children that you were saying that are at the border right now. Wait, would you answer this question real quick? No, I'm taking a picture real quick. I'm sorry. You're getting behind me and you're saying that you're fighting for women. No, I'm not going to back off. Don't touch me. Don't touch me. I'm asking her. She's saying that she supports Hispanic.
Those ladies asked her to take a picture.
I don't care. You're in my way. Don't talk to me. Don't talk to me.
Before you walked up.
She is damaging what is happening to Hispanic women and children at the border because she's promoting family.
But we begin tonight with fear, not just fear of bears or like weird anti-vaxxer candidates, other kinds of fear. Fear is part of our evolutionary biological heritage as high-end members of the animal kingdom, and it can be productive or destructive depending on the situation. The instinctual fear of danger can save you from, say, walking into traffic or staying in a haunted house when the ghost says, "Get out." It can also make you paranoid and angry about demographic or political change. Fear can keep you from trying new foods or traveling to new places or reveling in the advancements that we've made as a multicultural democracy. It can make you lash out at immigrants or your political opponents. In politics, it can also define your candidacy. The most successful campaigns combine a healthy fear of the other side with a positive message of hope. Donald Trump selected his running mate, J.D. Vance, at a moment of supreme confidence and zero fear. He just knew he was going to finally defeat Joe Biden, no matter who he selected or what he did or said or how long he rambled on at the Republican convention. It just didn't matter because the race was in the bag. But now that the race has shifted and he's facing a younger female opponent and a woman of color, no less, Trump is very publicly exhibiting what sure reads like fear. I mean, he must be afraid of going to prison, wouldn't you be? And this weekend, Judge Tanya Chutkan likely added to that fear by tossing out two of his lawyers' attempts to vacate the charges that special counsel Jack Smith brought against him for trying to overturn the 2020 election through fraud and violence. Chutkan denied his motions to dismiss the indictment based on statutory grounds and based on selective and vindictive prosecution. For the latter, she found that there was no evidence that prosecutors abused their authority or behaved vindictively when pursuing the case against Trump. A reminder that the one way that Trump can ensure that he stays out of prison is to become president again so he can take advantage of Chief Justice John Roberts and his fellow Supreme Court conservatives' conferral of near absolute immunity, a ruling they seem to design just for him. But now what's standing in his way is Kamala Harris, former prosecutor and senator and sitting vice president, whose list of grassroots supporters continues to grow. Tonight, two of those groups, Progressives for Harris and Comics for Harris, will be holding Zoom calls. And this morning was the kickoff of Republicans for Harris, a group that includes the former lieutenant governor of Georgia and former members of the Trump administration. The group is reminiscent of the 1964 Nelson Rockefeller attempt to derail Trump's radical right-wing predecessor, Barry Goldwater, who in 1964 became the farthest right Republican nominee for president prior to Trump. Goldwater, who opposed the Civil Rights Act, passed that summer and signed by Lyndon Johnson, who inherited the presidency after President Kennedy's assassination, was nearly as radical as Donald Trump, though much younger and more eloquent.
I would remind you that extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice. And let me remind you also that moderation in the pursuit of justice is no virtue.
Goldwater went on to be thoroughly thumped in the November election, which Lyndon Johnson won in a landslide. And Trump, who, like Joe Biden, is old enough to have lived through that history, is clearly so afraid of Joe Biden's vice president and successor that he has now officially backed out of the previously scheduled September 10 debate on ABC, citing that he only agreed to it against Biden and that he has ongoing legal conflicts with the network. Now, mind you, when Trump agreed to the debate, it never specifically mentioned Trump or Biden's names, but only candidates who appeared on enough state ballots to obtain 270 electoral votes and to reach at least 15% support in 4 separate national polls. And to the ongoing legal conflicts, Trump agreed to the debate 2 months after his filing his suit against ABC and anchor George Stephanopoulos, who's not even scheduled to moderate the debate. It is an act of obvious, raw fear, including a fear of ABC, after that network's correspondent, a black woman like Kamala Harris named Rachel Scott, pantsed the elderly Mr. Trump during the rather embarrassing NABJ forum that also featured an anchor from the network Trump prefers to host the debate. You know, the one that paid a $787 million settlement for lying to its own audience by falsely claiming he won the election. He would very much like that network to host a debate instead with a nice big Fox audience who can cheer for him and make him feel less old and weird standing next to the pretty prosecutor lady who will remind people of his crimes. Please and thank you. Donald Trump is afraid. And again, you can see why, given the stakes of this election for him personally, not to mention for the rest of us in our freedom and democracy. It's either he gets back into the White House and gets to be our dictator and do the bidding of the tech and oil billionaires who are funding his attempts to return to power, or he doesn't get back in and faces Jack Smith and Fani Willis in courts presided by rule of law judges like Judge Chutkan and Judge McAfee and maybe face a prison sentence. And since Joe Biden left the race and VP Harris entered it and became this super phenomenon among all sorts of voters, from black women and men to white women and white dudes and cat ladies and South Asian voters and LGBTQ voters, and now Republicans for Harris. And with polls showing Harris erasing the leads that he held over President Biden in the polls, fear is clearly taking over. Here's Trump this weekend.
Kamala, you know, there's about 19 different ways of saying it. She only likes 3. She wants the government to stop people from eating red meat. She wants to get rid of your cows. No more cows. She doesn't want anybody saying Merry Christmas. Now she's denying it. You go to the store, I want to buy a loaf of bread, darling. You come back, ma'am, I'm sorry, but your husband's been killed. If Kamala wins, it will be crime, chaos, and death all across our country.
She doesn't want anybody saying Merry Christmas. Joining me now is Simon Rosenberg, Democratic strategist and author of the Hopium Chronicles Substack. David Jolly, former Republican congressman and MSNBC political analyst. And Juanita Tolliver, Democratic strategist, MSNBC political analyst, and co-host of the What a Day podcast. And what a day indeed. Simon, I do want to start with you, though. Donald Trump is clearly freaking out. Okay, you can see he's kind of melting down. But here is there's a reason why. Let's look at these polls. He was consistently beating Joe Biden across these important swing states. That has now changed. Michigan tied. Pennsylvania tied. He's only up 1, and that's within the margin of error in Wisconsin. Arizona tied. Georgia, he's up 3, also margin of error. Nevada, Harris up 2. North Carolina, Trump up 3. And that's before the convention. Talk a little bit about these polls and how they're looking.
Yeah, listen, we've had a remarkable couple of weeks. I mean, this has been an historic election, but, you know, just using the 538 average, we've seen a 5-point shift in the election. Trump was up 3.2% before Biden dropped down, and now the vice president is up by about 2 points. There's been a huge shift. Some of the national tracking polls that we all follow have seen 5-6 point shifts towards her in the last few weeks. She's now very competitive in the battlegrounds. And I think where the race is today, right, is that, you know, we have momentum. As you pointed out, we haven't had our VP pick. We haven't had the convention. We haven't had what is going to be an unprecedented grassroots campaign kicking in the fall. And I think there's more upside for us. And I think that's why Trump is melting down and freaking out. He had one of the worst weeks on the national stage since he's been in this business in 2015, since he got into this game. And I think because part of what happened is that when she went ahead in the polling, it removed the central rationale of his campaign, which is that he's strong, he's leading, she's weak. That's no longer true. And I think they're really struggling now.
Yeah, I mean, David, saying I don't want to do this debate, I'm canceling. He pulled out of the debate formally, and then saying, no, I want a Fox debate. Like, that's running to a safe space. That's what they used to say. That's what they used to say about, liberals wanting to be in a safe space. He literally feels like the only place that he would be comfortable debating is on the network that lied for him about the big lie. Meanwhile, on the other side, you've got Jimmy Carter saying, I'm literally just trying to stay alive to vote for Vice President Harris. There is not a living former presidential candidate. The only one out of all the living former either presidents or presidential candidates who's supporting Trump is Sarah Palin. Not a single other one. And whereas Jimmy Carter's like, I will just stay on this earth alive just for her.
Look, I agree with Simon. I'd take it a little bit further. Donald Trump has had one of the worst chapters for a presidential candidate in modern political history ever since Vice President Harris got in. You could argue actually starting the night of his RNC speech. He has done everything wrong, and his team has failed to prosecute the case against Kamala Harris, and he has reminded the American people why they're tired of Donald Trump, why they don't like him. And look, he is scared to debate the vice president, but I would also say a lot of people who read that tweet from Donald Trump saying the debate is no longer with ABC, it's Fox, something that screamed off their screen was the power dynamic. It was somewhere between misogynist, childish, and boorish. But Donald Trump was telling the sitting vice president, I'll tell you where to show up because I'm making the call. Unless Donald Trump forgot, his address is now Mar-a-Lago, and Kamala Harris is the Naval Observatory. She's the sitting vice president. And so, look, I think she is right to say, I will debate you at ABC, and if you want to have a second one, perhaps we could have a second one. Donald Trump's doing everything wrong right now. His campaign is in free fall. It is spiraling, and he has no additional ceiling, even if he corrects, whereas the vice president has an enormous ceiling that we continue to see her push through.
Aaron, you've been covering Harris sweepstakes day in and day out. We hear this rollout is going to be major. How do you think it's all going to unfold?
I mean, look, this is a process that she knows well. I mean, she just went through it herself 4 years ago, right? Right now, it's just a whole lot of us sitting around waiting for the big news. It's high stakes. We're all kind of trying to read the tea leaves here. And so what's it going to come down to? I think, the campaign has said that there's going to be, this digital rollout at some point tomorrow. That's not unlike the way that we've gotten a lot of other news. I believe that might have been how we got the news about her. For 4 years ago, the announcement. I mean, it was a very tightly, closely held decision that then candidate Biden made, and we, a lot of us found out there was no leak, there was no scoop on that. The vice presidential nominee Kamala Harris was named, and then there was all the excitement. So I think that she's maybe trying to replicate that. I think it's going to come down to simpatico and who can help her win. And so you have those, apparently a white man maybe is one of the things that it takes to win. That's something that we saw in our poll for the 19th News and Survey Monkey, that Americans felt like she might have a better chance winning with a white man. So I guess we'll find out who the winner is in just a few more hours. Somebody who can deliver a state, perhaps, somebody who she has simpatico with, and somebody who, frankly, can help her win and has chemistry with her.
Susan, we've seen it sort of laid out because the process of picking a running mate has exposed the divide between Democratic progressives and moderates. Can you lay it out what the concerns are? We know it's a big tent party, and they've now made it clear all the different factions, their priorities.
Well, this has definitely played out in full public view, although in a very compressed and accelerated timetable. I think, one thing is that you've seen on the positive side, you've seen all these possible vice presidential candidates racing to the airwaves, getting out there as surrogates for Vice President Harris in the effort to show what a good vice president they would make. In a way, you wish the Democrats could keep that going. I imagine they would, enjoy having all of these very aggressive, accomplished surrogates out there on the campaign trail, and they got to find a way to make the losers tomorrow still engaged in the campaign. But to your question, I am wondering, once a choice is made, right, then that's where Democrats start doing their Democrat thing and, start fighting with each other in public again. Josh Shapiro, as the presumed front runner for this vice presidential nod, has taken a lot of the arrows so far. Both you've seen some dumps of opposition research against him, but also on the substance side, on the policy side, you've seen a lot of pushback from some of the pro-Palestinian protesters and their advocates on social media. But then the flip side is you see a lot of centrists say that's why he would be perfect, and that let's beat him up a little bit on the left, and that will convince centrists who actually might hold the key to this election that Shapiro is a good choice. So he's drawn a lot of the lightning so far. Mark Kelly, we've also seen some reporting about him in recent days that suggests that people are letting loose some damaging information, maybe to test how damaging it would be or not. We'll know in a few hours, as Aaron said. It's important to keep this in mind. Vice presidential running mates have not really proved decisive in recent elections. I saw one analysis suggesting you're looking at maybe 0.5% perhaps impact in key places. Remember that it was Barack Obama who won Paul Ryan's district back in 2012 when he was chosen as the vice presidential candidate for Mitt Romney in the key state of Wisconsin.
But Susan, can I just push back on one thing? We don't know that Democrats are going to start airing their dirty laundry after she makes that VP pick. We all thought that would be the case if Joe Biden stepped aside. We thought it would be a Democrat food fight and that the convention would be an all-out war. And that's not at all what happened.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. I'm interested to see whether we see a reversion to the norm or not, Steph. I don't know what's going to happen because in so many ways, this election is off the script right now. And, Democrats seem to have made an extraordinary choice, really. Many of them united to push out the incumbent president of their own party in the effort to win this election. So they may be willing to obscure differences that in a primary might have assumed paramount importance. We just don't know the answer. We'll know a little bit more tomorrow.
Reese, Republicans' answer to this big Harris campaign push is to send J.D. Vance on the road. Spending your summer with J.D. Vance, that is how you have been spending the last few weeks. How do you think this is going to go? You've been his traveling companion.
Yeah, I spent about a couple of days with him last week traveling the West Coast. And this is kind of what the Trump campaign kind of wants to happen. They want to send J.D. Vance out as this quote unquote policy attack dog towards Harris and towards the Democratic Party. And that's something that they're really trying to do. You've seen that, he has kind of come out and really talked about policy. In my interview with him, that was something that a lot of questions were geared towards policy, but that was kind of the thing that he really was more forthright in talking about was when I was asking him questions about policy. And you also saw his interview with the Nelk boys. When I asked him about the border wall and border security and kind of what he would want to talk about that, he said that the border security will be a mainstay in the election. I asked about Obamacare, and they talked about overhauling Obamacare, about how what that would look like and how they would want to pursue some reforms. And also about the tax credits. They want to cut the corporate tax rate back down to 15%, as Trump has said. They also, J.D. Vance, also a big advocate for a child tax credit, which is also in line with some Democrats as well. And so those are some of the policy things that they're really going to send him after.
Hold on. When did J.D. Vance become a big advocate for expanding the child tax credit? He may have changed his tune and said, I think I may vote for it, but that's certainly not J.D. Vance being a big advocate for it. When did that happen?
I guess I guess when I was talking to him, he was that was something that he did say he supported, that he would like to see a big child tax credit, with his words. And that is something that he does support.
All right, Aaron, Donald Trump weighed in on Harris's VP candidates, and here's some of what she said. Excuse me, some of what he said.
All of the people that she's looking at are considered much better than her. These were people that were thinking about running. They would have run, except that they didn't want to go through this roadblock with her, and because you're the vice president. So they wanted to go pick them, and I think virtually every one of them is considered better, smarter, would be a better president than her. But we can't allow her to be president. She's going to destroy our country. She'll ruin it.
Aaron, what is your take on this response, that all of these potential VPs are better than her?
Well, I mean, all of those potential other names that were out there quickly lined up behind Vice President Harris in the days after, I mean, literally hours after she said that she was going to earn and win this Democratic nomination, which, she secured that nomination with support from delegates within the first 32 hours. And as you said at the beginning of the hour, she managed to secure the necessary delegates to become the official nominee as of this evening. So if these candidates were better than her, they certainly didn't seem to think that their chances were better than hers, because they are endorsing her. And, just to go back to something that Reese was saying, I understand that J.D. Vance is out here trying to talk about policy, but that's not what the headlines are. The headlines are around, childless cat ladies and, dunking on Simone Biles pulling out of Tokyo. So, it sounds like the Trump-Vance campaign is pretty much on defense and kind of scrambling to get back into the headlines, as Harris seems to be poised to head into yet another week of momentum with this VP pick, her delegates secured, and, trying to shore up even more volunteers, supporters, and voters headed into the Democratic National Convention in a couple of weeks.
Well, let's talk about one of those policy issues. It's the first thing Reese mentioned, immigration. J.D. Vance wants to go on offense when it comes to immigration, and there's this idea that it could be a weakness for the VP. But NBC is reporting that VP Harris wants to go on offense, and she wants to do it this week. Susan, what do you think we're going to hear from her on this?
Yeah, she road tested this line of argument a little bit last week, Steph, and I thought it was quite successful. Essentially, rather than just accepting the idea that this is a big vulnerability of hers, she's using the fact that Donald Trump basically sank the bipartisan immigration deal that very conservative Senator Jim Langford had negotiated in the Senate with the blessing of Republican leaders. Donald Trump then sank that deal rather than give Joe Biden, then the candidate, an issue to use against him in September. But then he handed him an issue by doing that. And I thought Harris's use of this line last week was very crisp. And it essentially said, like, wait a minute here. You want to talk about immigration? Great. There's a bill. It's on the table. I've endorsed this. I'll sign it as president. Where are you, Donald Trump? And I think that is a very effective way. The other point that I would make about immigration is that for most voters for whom this is the top issue, they are already very likely Trump voters in this election. Immigration has been the most salient issue for Trump voters. Donald Trump himself believes this is the reason that he became president in 2016, is because he emphasized this issue. It's one of the reasons he goes back to it again and again and again. So in many respects, when Donald Trump talks about immigration, he's already talking to the converted in this campaign. And I think that Harris is likely to use that line and then move on to issues that might actually prove more decisive with the swing voters.
For the last 2 weeks or so, Donald Trump has been trying to distance himself from Project 2025. But now one of its key architects, a man by the name of Russell Vought, is reportedly still getting ready for Trump's return to the White House and him potentially having a big role in it. Reese, I thought that the Trump team once was trying to get rid of the plan. What is your take on Vought still being so closely tied to this campaign and the transition team?
Yeah, it's not just Vought either. It's John McEntee as well, who is a key Trump aide in the White House. I think the whole thing of them trying to separate themselves from Project 2025 might just be kind of them trying to separate themselves from the playbook while still trying to keep some of these allies that worked on the program close. Because a lot of these people that worked on the program are either alumni of the Trump White House or they are still pretty close to the former president. And so I think that it's just, I mean, he is just trying to get have his cake and eat it too, where he's able to say, oh, no, I don't really agree with Project 20.5. I'm going to get away from that. But also some of the people that are working on it, I still support and are likely going to still play a role in the second administration if that does happen.